things that we talk a lot about in our school and in working with children all the way up through 8th grade when we graduate and send them on here at least. And I know this is talked about in high school too, because I was a high school teacher, but is the kind of connection around executive functioning, which also has felt like spliced off in ways like,
Yeah,
you know, but how does that connect? I know you've talked about the salience network as one brain network, the executive control as
another way to carve it, right? You could these networks are fractals, right? You can get big and you can get narrow, and each one of those networks has multiple component, tinier networks, but it depends on the context how you invoke those, and right, it's incredibly complicated. And let's just be clear, you know, from the beginning of science to try to understand the brain, the way we've understood the brain has reflected the dominant technological advances of the era, right? So you had hydraulic humors being squeezed up and down in the brain. You had telephone calls going around the brain. You had computer, you know, processing programs happening in the brain. And now we've got networks in the brain. Okay, it's our best guess at what's happening. But all of those things are really just lenses onto something that's amazing.
You're talking about like the metaphors. I get it. Yeah, yeah. Like of understanding the brain.
Got it. Just they're metaphors that both enable and limit what you can see. So back to your question.
Well, yeah, I mean, but so like executive function is not dissociated from emotion, like it can't be if it's in the brain. You know, kind of like, I mean, you know, so much of what's changed for me in the last 25 to 30 years is thinking less about the brain as parts, you know, this part of the brain.
Yeah, you and the rest of the neuroscience community.
And the interconnectedness of not only a network across different parts of the brain, which invariably, as you've shown me, has some connection to like the crocodilian or reptilian parts that keep us alive, to, you know, to like how some of these networks actually both like have parts in common, right? Different networks.
Yeah, they use the same part, different, you know, different ways depending on.
And how some of them can't work while the other ones are working. Maybe in part because of that. I don't know. But
if you're well regulated, these things are trading off, right? Because it's like a balancing act, you know, it's a balancing act.
So I guess I'm asking how you help educators think about when we talk about, you know, there's often shorthand like, oh, kids need executive function support, you know, when they're disorganized or they're having a hard time following instructions, or, you know, so and it's making me think of this just because of the way you talked about how learning science is sort of built off cognitive science. And this is like, seems like a place of like, we're kind of, you know, shooting ourselves in the foot by just thinking about it as a separate thing from our whole selves and the emotional and social parts of who we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think what people like Barbara Rogoff's work has shown, right? So she's a incredibly accomplished and brilliant, you know, education psychologist and also anthropologist who's at UC Santa Cruz, right? You can go look online for her videos of her, you know, kids in her experiments in like, you know, rural Guatemalan villages and in more, you know, Western education spaces back in the U.S. and stuff like that. It's sending some links. But what she's really shown is that even basic capacities like attention are fundamentally organized by cultural values and norms and habits. So, you know, we think of attention as a thing, right? Legacy, you know, courtesy of the you know, the science, the Western organized science that studied it and invented it. And that, I'm not disparaging that work. That's a huge accomplishment to control everything just so that you can see it as a thing. But the problem comes when you then delude yourself into thinking that the thing is like a separate thing in the person. It is not a separate thing in the person. It is an emergent property of the person's pattern of functioning in the world that is built out of innumerable experiences as they've subjectively lived them being in their world. So Barbara Rogoff describes these Guatemalan mothers who are, you know, simultaneously cooking food over an open fire that's, you know, bubbling, and then weaving these incredibly complex tapestries where she has to keep taps of what threads are where, and watching their toddler, who's wandering around and playing and trying to weave their own thing and doing stuff, and the dog, from not falling in the fire, or, and she calls this hummingbird attention, like this very light touch attention, where that mother has developed the ability, the capacity to, to be managing many, many kinds of attention at once. And the cognitive neuroscientist told me that's not correct. That's not attention. That's not it. It's like, well, then what is it, people, right? It's a deeply cultural, adaptive way to attend. Had she just really zeroed in on the intricate pattern in her weaving, the toddler would fall in the fire, the dog would eat the chickens, right? Like, you can't do that, right? Because the world that she lives in is much more complex than that. So the idea here about executive function is, again, that scientists have done this amazing work to try to, pull out this construct, we call it, right? This capacity, and describe it as a particular encapsulated capability. But in reality, and that's useful, right, from a scientific perspective, but in reality, it's something that is an emergent capacity or emergent property of the lived experience of the person, as it's part of the way in which they come to be able to adapt themselves to contexts in advantageous, beneficial ways, right, that we were talking about earlier with the learning. So if you squint and look at the pattern of their capacity for adapting themselves to particular demands of particular kinds of contexts, you can call that executive function, or many different kinds of executive function. Like Yuko Munakata has this really nice construct of self-directed executive function as compared to sort of rule-directed executive function, which are one is internally derived, like, gee, I should change my strategy now, right? Versus the rule says do this, it's 10 a.m., do this, right? You know what I mean? Get to class on time, have a book on the desk, that's what I'm supposed to do, versus like, I'm working my way through this problem, I need to stop and recognize that I'm stuck. How would I rethink, right? Which is more self-directed executive function. So even in psychology, it's not one thing. But what it means for teachers is that, again, you bring a lens where you are thinking about what kinds of patterns of lived opportunities for experience are going to facilitate young people developing the capacities to be able to adaptively manage themselves. So if this kind of a setting requires that you have your book out and not left at home, and you have a pencil already sharp by 9 a.m. and blah, 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 then some kids are going to need more contextual support to be able to manage themselves in that space than others. That so be it, right? But that same kid who has trouble managing themselves in that space may also have amazing capacities that are the flip side of that lack of self-management in that space around ideation in some other artistic domain or something like that, right? So we really need to think about kids as wholes, and our work as teachers as being not, sticking stuff in the kid, but actually helping the kid to develop patterns that are adaptive in their world. And then again, really, really interrogating ourselves around what kinds of adaptive patterns are actually complicit in the recreation of inequities over time. I mean, think about it this way, any impact or effect of trauma on a person, short of being like actually hit in the head, right, is that the trauma, the effect of the trauma is the person's own adaptation to a particular kind of context. It's their ability to be able to manage themselves in the world in which they live. So if you live in a place that's dangerous, where you can't trust the people around you, you better be hyper vigilant and ready to stand up for yourself, right? The problem comes when you then move out of that context and you're out in the world, and, like people, this is, robust finding, people who were abused as children then often, too often get themselves re-ensconced in what other people would call abusive romantic relationships later. Why? Because that's what feels like love to me, right? That's the pattern that to me, I know how to behave in. So if you think of even trauma as not being like the person passively receives circumstances, but this is the person's adaptation to the world. They did this because it somehow enables them to manage themselves effectively in that world. Then you get a sense of the power of a person's own ability to manage themselves in the world as what in education we need to really be systematically enabling them to do.